thank you so much for being here tonight. My name's Joyce Linehan. I work in the mayor's office, and on behalf of the mayor, I'm very happy to welcome you here to Faneuil Hall for the second of our third Forums on the Future, which seems a little, it's kind of cognitive dissonance, right? Forums on the Future here in Faneuil Hall, but we're really, really happy to be here. So Imagine Boston 2030 is a comprehensive plan, and it's Boston's first citywide plan since 1965, so it was about time we did a new one. It covers, or it seeks to cover, all aspects of how local government can best serve a changing city. So we're looking at things like creating housing for a growing population and making it affordable, preparing for extreme weather patterns, growing job opportunities into the neighborhoods, supporting our waterfront and park system, and identifying the transportation needs of the 21st century Boston, and doing all of that through the lens of ensuring equity. The plan's been informed by more than 14,000 Boston residents, hundreds of policy experts, hundreds of community organizations, a lot of city staffers, including a very dedicated staff of two who've run the entire program, Natalia Urtubey and Rebecca Emanuel, who are both here tonight, who've done an amazing job to get us to the point that we're at. So why are we doing these conversations? As we get ready to release the final draft for public comment, we wanted to engage the public one more time and think about some of the sectors that most impact the development of the city. So last week we did the history and future of planning. We had a really great panel over at Edward M. Kennedy Institute, very, very enlightening. And we've got one more, May 9th, over at the Boston Public Library in Copley Square with the academic institution. So we've got 5 college presidents who are going to talk about the role that universities play in this kind of development. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our moderator for the evening. Sacha Pfeiffer got her first reporting job in 1944 at the Dedham Times before joining the Boston Globe in 1995. She was a member of the Spotlight investigative team that won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for its stories on clergy sex abuse. You probably saw her in the movie recently. Well, not her, but somebody playing her. After leaving the Globe in 2008, she hosted All Things Considered in Radio Boston for WBUR, and for her work at WBUR, she won a National Edward R. Murrow Award for Broadcast Reporting. Today, she's back at the Globe as a reporter covering nonprofits, philanthropy, and wealth, so she's exactly the right person for this panel tonight. Please welcome Sacha Pfeiffer.
Thanks, Joyce. As Joyce said, part of what I cover is nonprofits, philanthropy, and wealth. I love what I cover. And part of that is because for many people, when they work in the nonprofit sector, it's really out of an instinct to do good. Now, I know from covering the sector that the nonprofit world can be as bureaucratic and political as anything in the for-profit world, but I like that the instinct is there, that people really feel like they want to take their life and do something good, and they feel they can do it in the nonprofit sector. I like philanthropy because it shows that when people feel like they have extra money, rather than just buy something for themselves, another car, another house, they want to try to use their money to do good. And I like covering wealth because, again, I write about people often who are in a position where they have much, much more money than they need on a daily basis, and they're thinking really hard and creatively about how can I do something meaningful with my money? And that plays out in a lot of ways. Some people write a check to the Museum of Fine Arts. Some people want to give money to the Pine Street Inn homeless shelter. I wrote a story about a sort of brash venture capitalist in Boston who is used to having young entrepreneurs pitch their company ideas to him. And he reached this point in life where he felt like, I want to do something more meaningful than what I do now. So he decided to create a Shark Tank type competition for the nonprofit sector, where people who had interesting nonprofit ideas would pitch them to him, and the investors would potentially give those nonprofits money. Well, I wrote about this, and the nonprofit sector largely hated the idea because they felt like just because you're charismatic and can pitch a good idea on a stage does not necessarily mean that's the best idea for a nonprofit. But I like what I cover because you can write about those kind of creative things. And I think tonight's an interesting opportunity to talk about when Boston tries to think about what it wants to be and do over the next decade, what role can nonprofits and philanthropy and wealth play in that? So I wrote a story this week about a private family foundation. That means a foundation set up by people of wealth to get tax breaks to give away money for charitable causes. And my story was about the fact that the founder's 3 adult daughters are essentially being paid almost as much as the foundation has been giving out over the years. And one of the downsides of foundations is it can be a way, if they're abused, to put your kids on the payroll and write off fancy office space and so forth. But what was interesting to me is that some of the online comments said things like, "I will never donate money to that foundation." But what people didn't realize is that's not the kind of foundation you can donate money to. So that's part of what I want our panelists to talk about tonight, is what exactly our foundation is, and what is the difference. So let's have our three panelists come up. We have Jocelyn Sargent, she heads the Hyams Foundation. Paul Grogan. Paul Grogan, right behind her, is the head of the Boston Foundation, and then Jim Canales heads the Barr Foundation. So I'm going to sit, and if this feels awkward, please say, and we'll change. So I wonder if first the three of you could talk a little about your foundations, because Paul, the Boston Foundation as a community foundation, is different than what the Barr and the Hyams are as private foundations. The Barr and the Hyams were basically founded by families or individuals of great wealth who wanted to use some of their money in a charitable way. Paul, yours is a very different animal. Can you explain to us how the Boston Foundation is different than what Hyams and Barr does?
Yes, we're really in a different sub-branch of the philanthropic world of community foundations, which are all public charities as opposed to private foundations. So we are regulated very differently. We all also have a geographic mission as opposed to a topical mission, which many private foundations adopt. Another difference is that part of our mission is to try to expand philanthropic resources in Greater Boston, and so in addition to giving away a lot of money, as private foundations do, we raise a significant amount of money every year seeking to add to that wealth that's available for community purposes. Yet another difference, which has been very important, I think, in Boston, is that public charities, community foundations, have a much broader ability to engage in public policy than private foundations, which are really very sharply limited by law and what they can do. Now, we don't get involved in partisan politics or backing candidates, but we're able to be very engaged in public policy making, and we've tried to do that at the Boston Foundation. So we are a different animal, but we work very closely with the great private foundations in our community, and you've got two of them seated on either side of me.
And Paul, members of the public could actually write a check to the Boston Foundation, and the foundation would decide where that money should go.
That's right. Most private foundations are formed with the fortune of an individual or a family, and that's the sole source of the capital that the foundation has. Community foundations gather the resources we have from literally thousands and thousands of contributors. So that's yet another important difference.
Indeed, as Paul reminds me daily, we have the ability to write a check to the Boston Foundation, too.
So Jim, can you tell us about who's behind the Barr? Whose money is that?
Sure. So the Barr Foundation, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, was created in 1997 by Amos and Barbara Hostetter. Amos Hostetter came into his wealth having founded Continental Cablevision and then sold the company in the mid-90s. And they decided to put a significant portion of their wealth into the creation of the foundation. For those of you who have been in Boston for much of this time, you may know that the Barr Foundation was anonymous in its approach for roughly 10 to 12 years of its existence. So it's really only been in the last 7 to 8 years that people knew who was behind the Barr Foundation, because the Hostetters wanted to raise their family without necessarily having all of the foundation's activities be part of their kids' upbringing. That was really the reason that Barr started anonymously. In about 2009, 2010, the foundation became more public. One of the reasons that it did so is because in 2010, it made the decision to focus on climate change as one of its core areas of interest, and felt that lending its name as well as its wealth to the issue was important. And I'll speak about that a little later. And then I've now been here for about 3 years, and in that period of time, the foundation has also taken a much more open, transparent, and communicative approach to its work.
And I should really emphasize that there was this sense of mystery and secrecy that surrounded the Barr Foundation for a long time. And when Jim came to town, I wrote a story, and I think it was actually Joyce who had said something really funny that I quoted her on in the story. And we were talking about how people weren't even sure how you got money from the Barr, what they gave money to. And I think Joyce said it was almost like in The Wizard of Oz, you had to have a ruby slippers that you knocked together 3 times, and maybe that was a Barr Foundation grant. But Jim has really changed the approach, and it's a much more, they're much more open about what's happening now, and I think that's been a good thing. Jocelyn, can you tell us about who's behind the Hyams?
Absolutely. Unlike Barr or the Boston Foundation, the Hyams Foundation is a private foundation that was endowed in 1921 by Godfrey Hyams, and he and his family were active in the charitable giving for a number of years, and they did not, however, stipulate that family would be on the board. So we are, you know, in a very important sense, an independent private foundation. Our board and organization, our staff is led by people of color. We're very excited about that. It's a journey that has been in the making for over a decade, and we are at a point where we're able to do very exciting things around racial justice in the Boston and Chelsea communities.
So you have a founder who is no longer alive.
Absolutely. We do not have family members on the board.
And can you talk a little bit more about what you fund? Because that's, as you said, been a shift in recent years. The foundation changed the focus of what it wanted to give money to.
Yes, the foundation, when it started, has always had its roots in paying attention to marginalized communities. So immigrant communities and low-income communities were the focus of Godfrey Hyams when he started. However, over the years, we've continued our focus on low-income communities and youth. And in the last decade, we've shifted our focus to racial justice. And with our last strategic framework 2 years ago, we've identified the tactic, which is through systems change. So we do believe and partner with Barr and TBF around service delivery, which is very critical to low-income and communities of color. But we try to focus our dollars on advocacy and systems change work.
You want to explain what you mean by sort of a systems change?
Sure. So 3 of our focus areas are dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. That's very important to us that young people have a good start and that they're not tracked unjustly into the criminal justice system before they've had a chance to really get their full education and have the types of opportunities that will make them have successful outcomes. Another goal of ours is to work to make sure that that communities are able to live in neighborhoods where they have been committed to and they are affordable housing rates. So we are looking for making sure that communities are able to afford their housing costs. We all know that housing costs in major cities like Boston have been increasing over the last 2 decades. And for some people, that means that it's no longer affordable and they have to leave their homes. A third area that we concentrate on is on fair wages. And so we've done a lot of work to support community organizers, to work with business leaders to identify ways to bring cost of living community efforts together. One organization that we funded recently, I'm really excited about it, is the Boston Recycling Center, and they are actually pushing for livable wage green jobs, and it comes very much in alignment and coordination with some of the work that Barr is funding around climate change. So so those are our 3 priority areas, but we are very much interested in the community being the center of the work, and so we also do allow for community to define some of the issues that are facing them.
I met Jocelyn for the first time in February. We had a cup of coffee, and you said something interesting related to organizing. She talked about community organizing. You had talked about how organizing today is different than it used to be. You talked about Black Lives Matter and Occupy Boston. Yes. But if you want to fund those things, they're not traditional groups that can accept a grant. So what do you do if you want to back something like that, but it's not a conventional nonprofit?
So that's an interesting question. I'm glad you brought that up because that's something we've been struggling with. I think the sector as a whole, as we think through how do we support communities that are threatened now, communities that are facing harsh immigration policy, and some of those groups are not organized as 501c3s, and so for private foundation, that has to be our focus. So what we've been looking at is how do we resource the supportive efforts around, so beyond a grant. So at Hyams, I love that we have a philosophy that yes, we are grant makers, but we are also resource providers, and we support our groups with our community partners with our influence. We support them with training. So we can provide training. We can pay for a consultant to come in and share with the community how they can know what their rights are. And we can do other things like provide stipends for groups to go to different workshops or to participate in different individual development pieces. So we have to be creative in the way that we do our work, but I think, the team, it's new for me, but my team is very experienced and seasoned, and so we're very resourceful in thinking through innovative ways to help our communities meet their goals.
Jim, Jocelyn just mentioned this, but the bar has three sort of funding focus areas: arts, creativity, education, and then climate change, which is interesting. Can you talk about that piece, which is somewhat unusual?
Sure. So up until 2010, the foundation had a broad-based environment program, which did work in conservation, did work around supporting broad environmental organizations, did work around community health impacts, environmental impacts on health. And in 2010, the trustees made the decision that climate change was one of the most urgent issues facing us. And indeed, being here in Boston, as many of you know, particularly because of some of the good work that the city of Boston has done through the Climate Ready Boston effort. As some of you know, this is a particularly vulnerable community, vulnerable to sea level rise, vulnerable to other kind of weather event impacts. And so with that context, the foundation made the decision to focus on climate, and in particular, to focus on mitigation strategies, that is, strategies that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the two principal areas of focus in 2010 were around transportation and energy, because those are the two greatest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. When I arrived in 2014, as part of the leadership transition, we went through a strategic planning effort and looked at the work that we had done, took stock of it, also looked at how the broader context had changed, and we made the decision that staying focused in those areas made sense, but we made some modest refinements to our strategies. The energy effort became much more of a focus on clean energies and how do we scale renewable energy and how do we scale energy efficiency in our work. And the transportation work became more broadly framed around mobility, around how do we not only think about transportation, that is how people move around, but also how do we think about places where people live, how do we think about making places smarter, how do we think about transit-oriented development, a number of factors in the whole mobility context. In addition to that, because of what I noted earlier in terms of the particular vulnerabilities that we face here in Boston, we started a 2-year initiative on climate preparedness. And the principal grantee of that effort has been the City of Boston through the Climate Ready Boston effort, which I can speak to a little later. And in fact, I think some of these maps may even address some of what has been learned through that effort. But obviously trying to get a lot smarter about how Boston could be better prepared for what we know are the inevitable impacts, which we're already seeing, but which are only going to worsen over the next 50 to 70 years.
Any specific examples of what's being funded? It's focused a lot on waterfront development in part?
So the waterfront effort, which is more of a special initiative for the foundation, has a piece of it that is indeed about climate resilience. That is, how can we do development in a smarter way that's attentive to resilience? So in that effort, for example, we work in partnership with an entity called the Green Ribbon Commission, which is co-chaired by one of our trustees, Amos Hostetter, and the mayor. And the Green Ribbon Commission is a collection of business leaders and also representatives from the university community who come together and basically think about the ways in which their sectors can contribute to addressing both the greenhouse gas emission issues as well as the resilience concerns that we have. So specifically, some of the work that we have done there is through the Climate Ready Boston effort. One of the things that we did was we wanted to develop a much deeper and more credible scientific consensus about what was going to be the effect of climate change in Boston. And that's what resulted in the Climate Ready Boston report that was issued at the end of last year, which for the first time gave us some very clear and scientifically valid data about what we knew about sea level rise impacts. what we knew about heat and the ways in which certain parts of Boston were going to be subjected more greatly to the heat island effect, if you will. What we also knew about weather events and extreme weather events and the kinds of impacts that those would have. So that's an example of the kind of role that philanthropy can play, which is to help fund research, to help fund information, to help disseminate that information in ways that then inform the enactment of public policy, the enactment of zoning regulations, and certainly that would inform nonprofit organizations that work in this space.
And Paul, the Boston Foundation is easily the oldest and most established in terms of the three foundations represented here. And its funding areas are pretty sweeping. It does education, health and wellness, jobs and economic development, neighborhoods and housing, arts and culture. We've heard Jocelyn and Jim talk about how their foundations have sort of remain nimble when, Jocelyn switching to racial justice, Barr focusing on climate change. Is the Boston Foundation doing things too to stay nimble as issues change as time goes on in terms of what it funds?
Well, that's a great question. Like a lot of foundations, we've pushed ourselves to commit to achieving specific results, and our board of directors is very focused on that. And we have 5 priority areas that Sacha just went through where the lion's share of our resources are going. And in each of those areas, we are committed to a big idea, a potentially transformational development in that arena. But we realize that the Boston Foundation has played a very historic role in being open to ideas that come to it from the community, from people like ourselves. Here tonight. And we celebrated the centennial of the foundation a couple of years ago, and we did a deeper dive into the history of the foundation than we'd ever done. And one of the stunning things that we found was the number of times that the Boston Foundation had provided startup or seed capital to an idea or a young organization that grew up to be something very significant. Institutions as wide-ranging as the New England Aquarium, WGBH, and the birth of public television, most of the neighborhood health centers, Brigham and Women's Hospital, the Greater Boston Food Bank, cultural organizations like Landmark Orchestra, Commonwealth Shakespeare. The list goes on, and it's across all of these issues. Well, we didn't come up with those ideas. People brought them to us. And so, along with our 5 priorities and the accountability for specific results, we've set aside a pool of funds which we call the Open Door Fund, which is kind of the renewed invitation to the community to, whether your ideas coincide with our priorities at the moment, doesn't matter. Bring those ideas to us and we will try to be helpful. And so we will see if the balance that we've struck is the right one, but I'm very happy that we have returned to kind of an open door concept where folks who have great ideas can potentially get backing to try those ideas.
I also think of the Boston Foundation as having an incubator aspect in a way, because, for example, there's some philanthropy group in Boston focused on Hispanic philanthropy, organizations focused on helping or run by Latino or Latina people, and I believe that's based within the Boston Foundation, so it kind of benefits from the umbrella of the Boston Foundation.
That's right. That's another wonderful resource that the foundation can be to specific organizations. So we do have a Latino fund, which the Latino community has gotten behind and decided they wanted to have a resource specifically for organizations that are addressing issues in the Hispanic community. There's the Black Philanthropy Fund at the foundation focused on African American issues. There's an Equality Fund that is focused on gay, lesbian, and transgender issues. And so it can be a home for people who want to have some backing, some support, some logistics. And that can be very important to making the difference between whether an organization or an idea can go forward or not. So that's another, I think, very important dimension of your community foundation.
One of the issues I've written about in the past few months is the fears that the nonprofit sector has about the Trump administration. Trump has proposed tax reforms that have the potential to decrease incentives for charitable giving, which could hurt nonprofits. Clearly, we know that there's been a crackdown on immigrants, and that's often the constituencies that nonprofits serve. If you're going to minimize the size of government, then that's a chance that there'll be federally funded nonprofits will be cut off. Can each of you talk about how, do you feel like philanthropy is changing in the Trump era? Is the nonprofit sector changing in the Trump era? And what has your organizations do to adjust to that? Jocelyn, you want to start that one?
Sure. You know, it has been a very shifting landscape for us over the last several months. What I think, and I've been in philanthropy for over 20 years, so I have noticed from this philanthropic community in Boston that we have really band together to begin to coordinate and to align our efforts, because we all do a number of things differently. We all have different missions, but we all care about our communities. And so we're trying to figure out what are the approaches and how do they all work together so that we can support the communities that we serve. So that's one thing. And I mean, it seems minor, but I have to tell you, alignment and coordination in philanthropy is huge. It's like, it's the problem that I've been grappling with in the 20 years I've been in philanthropy.
What does that look like when it's not aligned and not coordinated? What's bad about that?
Well, part of what happens is we actually may sometimes foster conflict and competition on the ground. So, you know, if we back one group and we don't back another, you know, we're not making these choices in alignment with each other, then we can unwittingly create those conflicts in the field. That's not anything any of us want. And we have definitely been talking about it, I think the sector as a whole, for many years. But I think the last several months have given us an opportunity and a stimulus, an incentive to really move more quickly on collaboration in a real way, so that we think about common applications. So we've talked about common applications, and we even have designed one. I mean, we participated in one. Those conversations go on and off, but now it's really, we have to figure out a way to be nimble, and as you mentioned, and to actually make it as easy as possible for the communities that are facing the most change and the harshest aspects of the policy. So we don't want our application process and our reporting process to make it more difficult for them.
What do you mean by common application?
A common application is one in which the same type of information is asked on every application for no matter what philanthropic institution you're applying to. So as we think about revamping our our application, we've been looking at BAR, we've been looking at TBF, we've been looking at the Associated Grant Makers Common App form that a number of philanthropic institutions use, because we want people to be able to focus on the work, as opposed to how do we get the money out of these different institutions. So that's one thing we've been doing.
Yeah, Jim, you want to jump in? I know there's a special initiative at BAR related to this.
I do, and I just want to pick up on Jocelyn's point, because I want to make it tangible in terms of some of the things that we've done at BAR, which quite frankly have been enabled by work that colleagues at the Boston Foundation and the Himes Foundation have done. One of the things that we saw post the election was a number of what I would characterize as frontline service organizations that were simply being deluged with needs for their services. So organizations that were serving immigrant populations, organizations that were serving refugee populations, organizations that were serving LGBTQ, transgender populations, where there were concerns about safety and about implications of the kind of rhetoric that was coming out of the administration, as well as some of the policy changes that were being enacted. This is not a space that BAR was active in any way, and yet we felt that we needed to be responsive to this moment. So the trustees authorized several $1 million to do a number of things. One was to provide support to those very organizations, and frankly, to do it in a way that was going to be as nimble and was going to be as user-friendly as we could. So the first thing that we did was to contact our colleagues at foundations like TBF, like Himes, that knew much more about this landscape than we did, to understand what they were seeing, what they were funding, and how our resources could augment what they were already doing. And we ultimately turned around very quickly, within about 6 weeks, to award over $1 million in grants to a set of organizations that were working in Massachusetts. The grants that we made were general operating support grants, and they were multi-year grants. For those of you who are in the nonprofit community, both of those are kind of like manna from heaven to hear those terms. General operating support meaning unrestricted support, and multi-year meaning it wasn't just a 12-month grant. In all of the cases, they were 3-year grants. The other thing that we did, because there was another sector that was being deluged, and this is Sacha's sector, is the media. The media had been declared the enemy of the American people, to use a quote from the President of the United States. And there was concern about investments in the media, investments in investigative journalism, and investments in protecting freedom of the press, which is indeed the cornerstone of our democracy. So we then proceeded to make $1.5 million of investments in a number of organizations. This was more of a national effort. But there again, we partnered with other foundations that had much more expertise than we did. We piggybacked on work that they had already done, and we simply sought to augment contributions that they were making. I think this is important because to Jocelyn's point, this is not how foundations behave. And I don't say this to tout what Barr is doing. I simply say it because I think Jocelyn is right, that part of what this era calls for is that we need to think about our work in very different ways. We need to think about how we adapt our business strategies, if you will, in ways that are more receptive and responsive and user-friendly to the communities that we're serving. So in our small way, we're trying to do that, and I know my colleagues are doing the same.
When you say not usually how they behave, you mean traditionally kind of slow to move, not willing to shift beyond their traditional funding priorities?
Well, you and I were on a panel a month ago where one of the panelists said, foundations, if it takes longer to get a grant than it does to have a child, something's wrong. And it is true that there are foundation processes that take more than 9 months. And that should just not be the case. So I think that's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
As Jim mentioned, one of the things Barr has decided to fund is journalism. Now, places like the Globe can't benefit from this because we're a for-profit. We can't take charitable money. But you may know there are many journalism initiatives now that are nonprofit. So WBUR got money from Barr to create an investigative unit. ProPublica, which is a great national reporting website. Center for Investigative Reporting, New England First Amendment Coalition, Committee to Protect Journalists. That's a pretty unconventional way of thinking about what philanthropy can support and what is a civic cause. But it's a really interesting approach to think about, where can philanthropy do good in ways that aren't traditional?
I would just say before Paul chimes in that what's critical about those decisions, and I think all three of us are thinking about this, at the end of the day, whatever we're doing in response to this administration and to the era in which we find ourselves has to be grounded in our values. And for us, our values are about how do you invest in a healthy democracy? And that's what leads to that kind of grant making.
And I definitely want Paul to chime in because the Boston Foundation has been issuing what it calls emergency grants. Can you talk about those?
I can, but I want to point out first that I think that in answer to your question, Sacha, what's the effect of Trump on philanthropy is we know a lot less than we're going to know. We're at the very early stages, and a lot of what the president has proposed has not been approved. But the one area for us where there's clearly been a huge impact, even though what he wanted to do has not been approved there either, is in the area of immigration, just because of the spontaneous, organic reaction of the community to the multiple threats that seem to be bearing down on them. And the Boston Foundation has been very involved with the immigrant community forever. We were formed during the period of the greatest immigration to this country, between 1880 and 1920. Community foundations were in large part set up to help deal with issues related to immigrants, helping them make their way into American life, helping them with health care and education and so forth. And we have stayed involved with the immigrant community since then, and we are just unabashedly a pro-immigrant foundation. If you look at the renaissance of Boston today, for instance, it wouldn't have happened without the immigration that occurred. The entire positive increment of population that has come into the city in the last 15 years or so is almost exactly equal to the immigrant migration into the city. So you can say truthfully, no immigration, no Boston Renaissance. That's how big an issue this is. And so we have been deeply, deeply concerned, and we're working on 3 levels. One is a set of emergency grants to the organizations that we know are really carrying the weight and trying to respond to this, tremendous fear and apprehension that's out there. We've also held major forums at the foundation to explore the different dimensions of this and what people can do about it, what the legal distinctions are and all of that. And finally, we're trying to work with a much broader constituency outside the foundation about this issue, because if you look at the demographics of this part of the country, Immigration is so vital. We are slow growing. We have a low birth rate, below replacement levels. We have the most rapidly aging workforce in the United States, in this region. You know, if we don't have a healthy flow of immigrants, the economy is going to suffer enormously. Our universities, which really are providing, the research universities, much of the ecosystem for this economic boom and the innovation economy that we celebrate. If immigration is curtailed significantly from now international students that are coming to our universities, that's yet another body blow to New England and Boston and our quality of life. So we think thus far on the Trump hit list, we have the most to fear in terms of its wide-ranging effects if they carry through with their immigration plans, which will be disastrous for our part of the country.
Paul, off the top of your head, if you can remember, can you give the crowd an example of what organizations have been getting these emergency funds so they have a sense of what are the organizations you see being on the front line that feel most threatened?
Right. Well, one of the big issues, and most of the organizations we're supporting are doing this, is getting legal services to individuals and families. So, and you know, we were the founding funders. Again, that's there at the beginning of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Association, MIRA. We're working very closely with organizations like that have a track record, that have the relationships in place, and our funding allows them just to ramp up, particularly in the legal services area.
And then, Jim, some examples of organizations that are getting special grants from the bar because of the sort of political climate?
Sure. So MIRA is a good example of the work that we're doing in that zone. We've also made grants to the Lenny Zakem Fund, and that's actually permitted us the opportunity to actually do what, and sorry to get into jargon here, but to do re-granting, which is often how we can work with organizations that also have the capacity to do grant making themselves. And in addition, Sacha noted a number of the grants that we've made in the investigative journalism and the protections of freedom of the press. All of these grants are up on our website. Would invite you to take a look and see the kind of work that we're doing. We also approved a few more today that we'll be making public in the next week or so.
We've been talking a lot about writing checks, foundations that can give money to organizations. But foundations also have influence in ways that doesn't involve money. And Jocelyn, when you and I met, you actually said something that was very memorable to me. You said, in our society, money has power. So when wealthy people say something, there's power behind it. Can you give some examples of the ways you feel like the wealth of the foundation and the influence of the foundation can have impact without just writing checks? What else can you do?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we've been looking at, and we have funded a number of groups, particularly, and I want to highlight this, in the Muslim, Arab, South Asian community. That's a community that is smaller, relatively speaking, and it is growing, and it is particularly under siege. And so we support groups like the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center, and we work with national groups that connect Masa communities across the country, like the Proteus Fund. So we are concerned about making sure that we do support fledgling groups that need our help. We're also looking at other ways to support groups. So for example, I did say that, and one of the things that I thought about is we can be influential in getting people to the tables that they would not ordinarily be at. We have been working closely with the city on thinking through how do we do more of that? How do we bring more community voice to policymakers? I think a lot of times the way that community voice happens in policy decisions is there's protests. However, we have a receptive city government, and I think there's a way to engage communities, and so we're problem solving together. We're identifying solutions together as opposed to always needing to be conflictual. Not that it doesn't need to be conflictual sometimes. So I think bringing our influence to providing that space where we're bringing the business sector to the table to talk with the community partners about what's happening in their community and how business practices are impacting them. Another thing that we're looking at, and I have to mention this because recently Ford Foundation, they did a big press announcement that they'll be spending $1 billion on PRIs, on program-related investments, from their endowment, and you know, that made a big splash, and it's great. And Ford really, I have to give credit to Darren Walker, their president, because he really has shifted the way the sector thinks about, well, we have 5% that we're required to give out, but what do we do with our corpus? What do we do with the 95% that sort of sits in the bank? So at Hyams, we have a tradition of making program-related investments. We actually did our first one in 1986. I think, Paul, you were involved in that one. And we have always done our program-related investments out of our endowment. So what's interesting is that it's a shift in the sector because program-related investments are usually done out of the 5% of the grant-making budget.
So we should explain that a rule for a foundation is that they have to give away at least 5% of their money. Now that can include, I believe, salaries.
It can include salaries.
Because it's viewed, the people you're paying are doing charitable work, so that counts for your charitable output. But what's happened is that for many foundations, that's become the ceiling. 5% was meant to be the floor, at least 5. A lot simply stop at 5 and the rest sits in the bank, and that's controversial. Some people feel like more money should be spent, and it sounds like Hyams is doing that.
Absolutely. First of all, we budget to 5.4%. So that we make sure that we are not underspending. I definitely have been at foundations where we consistently underspent the 5%. So that's really a challenge when you know that there's that community need out there. But there's also the need to effectively use the remaining that you're not required to use on investing in community. And we have always used our endowment to basically walk our talk, to invest in communities with the endowment dollars that typically are reserved to grow your budget for the next year. So we have always felt that commitment to the community. I mean, it's been a small community, but what we have to do at Hyams and what my incredible board has tasked me to do is to become more visible. Because by simply making the statement, by Darren Walker saying, we're gonna invest our endowment, because we think communities will give us return on investment. We think equality pays. That's basically what it means. We think that justice and equality pays. We think you can get return on your investment for that. And so we're willing to take that chance with our endowment dollars. And so we've done that. And so for Hyams, we've just got to get out there and tell the story so that we can actually encourage other parts of the sector who might not be as anxious to do that. So.
Jim, the Barr Foundation is a great example of a foundation that has, I think, is comfortable being influential beyond just writing checks. Can you talk about the ways you can be influential beyond giving away money?
Sure. I think one of the important obligations that foundations have an enormous amount of latitude. And I think with that comes the obligation to think about the ways that we can use our voice to advance the issues that we care deeply about. So yes, and as Jocelyn noted earlier, we are grant makers. That's part of what we do. We make grants. But I think we leave a lot on the table if we don't also find ways to complement that grant-making activity with opportunities to bring our voice and our perspective and the perspective of those we support to critical issues that are facing the areas that we work in or our region. So to give an illustration that Sacha alluded to earlier in the panel, one of the things that we've done in the last year has been to launch a waterfront initiative. It's an effort that is very much about how do we take a long-term view and think about the responsible stewardship of Boston's waterfront. It is truly one of the treasures of this area. It's also a treasure that was ignored for many, many years because of an elevated expressway. With that being gone and the city being opened up to the water, it creates tremendous opportunity to think about how do we create open space so that all of our residents and citizens and visitors can enjoy the beauty of that waterfront? How do we do it in a way that is resilient and that is sensitive to the kind of climate impacts that we're going to have? How do we think about the waterfront being another form of mobility that actually moves people around in a city that, as we know, is deeply congested in so many different ways and makes mobility a real challenge? And how do we, to come back to Joyce's term when she opened this panel, how do we think about the role of equity? And how do we think about making this a waterfront that is accessible to all and not just accessible to people who can afford to live in high-rise condos that are being built upon that waterfront? So for BAR, our motivation is, how do we take a 50-year view about the waterfront? How do we ensure that we are stewarding it for future generations so that we are not making decisions today that in 20 or 30 years we're going to regret? And quite frankly, if you look at the South Boston waterfront, there are many people who lament what has happened there. I was not here when those decisions were made, and so I can't speak to all of the dynamics that were going on. But I would say that the number of people that I have met who say, what did we let happen there, and how did we let that turn into what many people view as a soulless part of the city, is something that I think we want to make sure doesn't happen. So we've invested to date in the last year $6 million in a number of efforts, advocacy efforts, planning efforts, open space efforts. We intend to remain a significant investor in this work. A lot of the planning is going to hopefully generate some compelling and arresting and exciting ideas that we hope a multitude of partners are going to get behind. But this is an area where we feel not only can we contribute dollars, but we can contribute our voice, and quite frankly, we can push for having a bigger vision for what Boston's waterfront can be.
And Paul, the Boston Foundation, clearly an example of a foundation that has more influence than just its money. You think of yourself as a convener. You commission a lot of reports that measure the health of the city in a variety of ways. What's your view of that role of the Boston Foundation?
Well, this was something that was a change that was made very deliberately by the board of directors of the foundation just as I was coming on. And for most of its history, the Boston Foundation had been a quiet, behind-the-scenes organization making grants and stewarding philanthropic assets and doing an incredible job. I mean, the Boston Foundation has had a stellar reputation nationally for a very long time. But the board, reminded themselves that grant making is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, a means to solving problems, and that there are ways besides grants where one can make progress on issues if one has influence, if one has data, if one has relationships. And so very deliberately, the board of directors called for what has really been a radical change in the role of the Boston Foundation in this community. What we have done, in effect, is create a kind of a think tank and grafted it onto the foundation. So we, as Sacha mentioned, we commission, we're the home of the Boston Indicators Project, and we commission a great deal of research. We have 15 to 20 very well-attended public forums at the foundation every year. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, we're very involved in public policy. And this has actually come to be called a new model of a community foundation called a civic leadership model, where grant making is viewed as something significant, but just one tool in the toolbox that may be used to advance a cause or an issue. And I was frankly delighted to witness the evolution of the Hosteters and the Barr Foundation because I think embedded in their move from anonymity to being willing to exercise influence is that recognition that the problems we're taking on are very tough, they're very difficult, they require maximum effort, they require us to be imaginative in what we do to solve those problems. And I think the influence of these institutions is benign and helpful.
I believe that Jim at least has heard me say this before, but when I do investigative stories, it's not surprising that a lot of people say they want to speak off the record. I've been surprised that when I do stories about nonprofits and philanthropy, I've had more people ask to speak to me off the record about nonprofits and philanthropy than they do when I'm doing investigative work. But it makes sense, because if there are problems in the sector, the nonprofits are often very nervous to talk about it because they don't want to upset a funder or a grant maker for risk of losing the grant. They don't want to alienate the person who writes the check. So I found that I feel like problems end up persisting in this sector because people are very unwilling to talk about them. Can each of you talk about something you think philanthropy does wrong or does badly or should be better? Jocelyn, you want to kick off if something comes to mind right away?
Something does come to mind right away. It's one of the issues that I've struggled with the whole time. I think we have a huge platform, and this is what you alluded to a minute ago. We have a huge platform that we are the bedrock of civil society. and democracy. So we hold that space, and it's incumbent upon us to use it. So one of the things that we could do better is we could do a better job of supporting advocacy work. We get a little nervous because structurally there's not a way for us to directly give information to policymakers or to elected officials. That's not lobbying. However, there is so much knowledge that we have working on the ground with community partners that we really have to be creative in figuring out ways to get that information to those decision makers, because we're holding back. And I think this is not helping our communities advance forward. So we could support advocacy work more boldly, just in terms of the way that we make our grants, but we also can do more in making our point of view known, and doing it in a way that is not lobbying. So that would be great.
These are hugely privileged roles, and I think the moment that we cease to remember how privileged they are, we cease to be effective as grant makers. And so my observation would be, in terms of what we have done wrong as a sector and what we need to constantly be thinking about, is the great occupational hazard of working in philanthropy is arrogance. And the fact that you can come to believe that every idea you have is a great idea, and you can come to believe that when you're meeting with your partners out in the field and they're telling you what a great idea it is, that you actually believe that, as opposed to inviting dissent and inviting criticism and inviting a different perspective and building the kinds of long-term relationships that will enable people to be honest with you and to tell you, you know, that doesn't make any sense, or that's an idea that you dreamed up in your nice fancy foundation office that is not going to play well in this community. So I think the issue of how we retain humility as a core value for philanthropic work is something that we all need to continue to work hard on. It's where the sector falls down, it's where the sector imposes its ideas on communities, and it's where communities become resentful of philanthropy for very legitimate reasons.
I remember soon after you came to town, Jim, one of my colleagues, columnist Shirley Leung, wrote a column about you, and I think the opening line said something like, Jim Canales is about to become everybody's new best friend, because you're basically giving away money of a billionaire, right? So how do you make sure you ever hear the truth and people are really telling you what's going on the ground when everybody would like you to write them a check?
Well, I talk to people like you, because you certainly never hesitate from telling me the truth. I would say that part of it is also just building relationships with people. I mean, I'm looking out in the audience, and there are a number of you in the audience that I've had the privilege of getting to know since I've been here, and hopefully we have built the kind of relationship where and I know Jocelyn and Paul do this too, where you communicate the sense that you are inviting people to push back on your ideas. You're inviting people to dissent. You're inviting people to work with you, work through a set of issues with you. So a big part of it is the way in which you approach the relationships that you're creating. And as a leader of an organization, I think a big part of it is, what is the tone and what is the culture that you're trying to create? I benefit hugely. Many of you in this room know the people that I work for. I benefit hugely from a reputation that Barbara and Amos Hofstetter have of being humble, caring, deeply committed individuals who do not bring a perspective that their ideas need to win the day. And so, because that's already in the DNA of the foundation, it's there, but it's something we have to work on every single day and remind ourselves.
Paul, what do you think philanthropy does wrong?
A couple things, and a related point to what Jim is talking about. You know, foundations just have a huge accountability problem because people won't tell us the truth about how we're doing. They're afraid of doing that. We have a little easier time of it because we're local and place-based, and we have very broad interests. So we're embedded in an incredible web of relationships that does yield real information about how we're doing. I think private foundations, and particularly national foundations, have just a huge problem of not getting the kind of information that would allow them to improve. So unlike, you know, the business world, which has a way of giving feedback, and the political world, which has another way of giving feedback, it's largely absent in the foundation world, and therefore foundations who are serious about accountability and improving their performance have to take extraordinary measures to get real information about how they're doing. And one tool that's grown up, which is useful, is the blind survey. and we do this every couple of years, and many foundations do, and there's an organization here in Boston, the Center for Effective Philanthropy, that does this work, where you go out and do blind surveys so people can anonymously say what they really think about how you're doing, and those things are very important. So that's one, the accountability problem. A second one is the fragmentation of the sector. There are just an enormous number of organizations doing very similar work or the same work. Nonprofits proliferate very easily in our society, and resources are very, very fragmented. And then you add to that unlike the private sector, there's no organized labor market in the nonprofit sector. It really has to be improvised. And there's no organized capital market either. Even the most successful nonprofit organizations have trouble raising money, whereas if they were in the private sector with an equivalent to the profit, they would find those resources easily. So even the most effective organizations getting the best results have trouble scaling up so that they could really be moving the needle either in a city or a region. So I think those are a couple of things that the sector really has to worry about on a continuing basis.
When Paul talks about fragmentation, another way to put it is, are there too many nonprofits? That's a little simplistic. I think the better question is, are there too many nonprofits doing the same thing, replicating the same work? I wrote a story a few months ago about a college readiness nonprofit that was going to come to Boston, I think actually is in Boston. And there was this outcry from other nonprofits, because they said, we already have 40 of those in Boston. So the question is, should they merge? Do we really need another? Is it better to give more money to the existing ones than to bring in a new one? But you never want to squelch a good idea or a person with an inspirational idea. Jocelyn, is your view, you've been here in Boston under a year, too many? Are there too many duplicating efforts?
Well, there are not too many efforts because there's more work that needs to be done, but I think that there's significant duplication and overlap, and I think actually communities could work better. I think this is where we can do a better job by providing the space for community partners to have that conversation with each other and figure out what they're going to do. I think often, we love our groups, we love our leaders, and sometimes we have to make the hard decision to say, we are going to be here and we see this happening and we need you to think about how you might address that. And it's not that we're telling you to do that, but there is something to creating dependency, which is a challenge that all sectors face, all nonprofit philanthropy relationships face. But I think that we can do a better job of really supporting that so that groups are not afraid to tell the truth about what's going on. I mean, this is a great community, I have to say. People are very generous here. So I come from the South, so let me and it's not that people in the South are not generous. They're not generous necessarily towards causes of fairness and justice. And I would like to see more of that in that region. But here in Boston, we have those principal values. And I think part of the challenge is working across neighborhoods, and I know the city is working with this, because we have such unique individual neighborhoods, and to really get the community to think broader than its own neighborhood and its own. I had to learn what village I was in. I live in Newton. I was like, what do you mean? Where do I live? I live in Newton. And that is a beautiful and remarkable, and it also is, it makes a community more cohesive and vibrant. But the downside is it makes a community more cohesive and vibrant within itself. And so I know that the sum of the parts can be greater than the whole, and that is what we as philanthropy can help the neighborhoods do better.
Paul, the Boston Foundation had an effort where it was trying to encourage nonprofits to merge, and I think that effort kind of petered out a little bit. What was that, and what happened to that?
This was something called the Catalyst Fund that we and a number of other funders put together to explicitly encourage organizations to explore consolidation or outright merger. And a number of great mergers were supported by that Catalyst Fund, but I would say in general the deal flow was disappointing. There were far fewer applicants for this funding than we had hoped. So we did let that spend down, and we're not renewing it. However, I want to say the Boston Foundation remains very interested in assisting organizations that are exploring consolidation or merger, and so we're going to keep on doing that, and we think there's a lot of room for that. We were very unpopular a number of years ago when we had a big forum at the foundation and really raised this issue. A lot of folks in the nonprofit community were kind of annoyed with us, but I think some years later, there's a recognition that we've got some things going on that don't go well together. For instance, resources available to the sector are flat, but there are many, many more resources than there are many organizations than there used to be. And what this means is that there's a tremendous amount of money going into back office and administration and finance instead of program. So in addition to outside mergers, one of the things we have seen and participated in is back office consolidation, where groups that are perhaps engaged in similar activities can put their administration operation together, maintain their programmatic independence, but save some significant money. The 10-Point Coalition and the Black Ministerial Alliance did that some years ago and saved a lot of money that was then available to do what they really want to do. So I do think, however uncomfortable it may be to acknowledge this, I think there's a lot of room for consolidation, particularly of mature organizations. Well, what we do not want to do, you hear people say, we don't need any more nonprofits. Well, the formation of new nonprofits is very, very important in this community. Think of the innovation that's come from the city years, the Year Ups, the citizen schools, the Bells. And we don't want to cut off that oxygen supply of innovation that's coming in the form of new organizations. So it's really should be focused much more on the mature organizations where consolidation could be really beneficial.
Sacha's story, though, this weekend, I think shows what the problem is with that kind of proliferation when you don't have the kind of oversight that you need for 90,000 private foundations in this country. Moreover, to the theme of transparency and accountability, the question of how transparent and accountable those foundations are is out there. But in addition to that, you're also seeing the rise of new giving vehicles, new ways of doing, quote, philanthropy that aren't the traditional, let's set up a donor-advised fund at the community foundation, or let's create a private foundation. Rather, you're seeing the creation of limited liability corporations. So you have Chan Zuckerberg, you have the Emerson Collective, you have, and this has been one of the older ones, the Omidyar Network, entities, and this is with no judgment on those donors, but entities who do not have to report where their resources go. And so the question of what that brings to the philanthropic sector is, I think, and I raise this only because we were invited today to talk about the future of philanthropy, and I think this is the future of philanthropy, as you have younger donors who want to see more impact more quickly, that the notion of the kinds of impulses that created the foundations that we run and many of the donor-advised funds that Paul has at the Boston Foundation, which was an impulse, we made wealth in our lifetime, now we want to leave something as a legacy, and that legacy will subsist for many, many years. Now you have donors saying, we're going to do the giving while living, and we want to see impact for the dollars that we're investing today. And that creates a very different dynamic in the sector that I think is worth exploring.
We want to open the floor to questions as well. We can keep talking, but is there anyone who would like to ask a question of either Jocelyn or Jim or Paul? Anything that we've talked about or any new issues you'd like to bring up?
I'll toss one out there. Thank you, Jim. So back on this topic of thinking of ways that foundations will be different in the future, and more specifically in reaction to the election and the changing landscape at the federal level, one of the truths of philanthropy, I just happened to spend the day with 8 other local nonprofits in Boston of all different shapes, sizes, and issue areas, and we were discussing funding strategy. And so I bring you some of those thoughts from that conversation. And one of the reflections is that it has been a truth that foundation money was not generally there for long-term operating support. There have, of course, been really important exceptions that all 3 of you represent, given your longevity, the foundation's longevity. But that in general, operating support, the big operating support, is the public sector's responsibility, the federal government, the state government. 7 out of 8 of the, or 6 out of 8 of those nonprofits are heavily reliant on government funding, and there are going to be potentially significant cuts at the federal level. And so while normally we might all a year ago have said, yes, that's right, we should keep those separate, what are your thoughts if there are the dramatic kinds of cuts that we're expecting at the federal level around many of the issues that are critical and that you've historically funded in? Will there be a shift? Do you think there will be a rethinking of how foundations consider their role if we also consider that the corpus, those assets, were originally taken out of the public taxable funding base, and there's been a dramatic shift in the federal landscape? What is philanthropy's conversation going to look like in revisiting this, given the change context?
You're the dean.
Well, I think the answer is yes. There is going to be a radical rethinking, but what the shape of that is very difficult to determine, given the uncertainty surrounding what will actually be enacted by this administration. So it's really very difficult to do more than speculate at this point. But there could be some just stunning withdrawals of resources that would, and my favorite example, because I was very involved in creating this originally, is something called the low-income housing tax credit, which is the federal subsidy that is accounting for the overwhelming majority of affordable rental housing that's being constructed in the country. It's been a vital resource. As bad as our housing problems are, they would be infinitely worse had we not had the low-income housing tax credit and a cadre of terrific grassroots community development corporations and private developers who have fixed up the city to an extraordinary degree. If in the tax bill that eventually passes, if one does, that's eliminated, it will be a catastrophic effect on that segment. And I don't know what we'll do about that, because there's no way that can be made up in any meaningful way. So it really does depend on what the substance ends up being. You mentioned core operating support. I did want to say a word about that, because along with the other shifts I described in the Boston Foundation, we made a decision some years ago to shift to almost all a core operating support for our grantees. And our view is that grantees know what to do with the money. We want them to focus on the results that they're trying to achieve, and we want them to achieve. And it's been a huge positive for us, and I think for the organizations that we fund. But the overwhelming majority of foundations in America do not do core operating support for their grantees. It's program-specific funding. And I think I would add that to my list of defects of the sector, this really reluctance to provide support in a way that would really unlock and liberate the energy of the people that we're trying to help.
Two responses, Laura. I think one, just to echo what Paul said, I think it would be very difficult to conceive that private philanthropy is going to be able to fill the kinds of gaps that we may see by virtue of some of these changes. One of the areas that we obviously care deeply about and invest in is the arts field. And the National Endowment for the Arts, as you know, has been threatened. That is $153 million in annual appropriations. That obviously then has impact for the various state agencies here in Massachusetts. It's between 14 to 16 million, depending on where you are in the budget negotiations that take place. BAR's program, while significant at roughly $15 million a year and being a statewide effort, is never going to be in a position to fill that gap entirely. In fact, one of the things I often think about in this context is that our annual grant-making budget of $80 million, which is significant, would be enough to fund BPS for about 26 days, the full budget of Boston Public Schools. And that's just one piece of what the city of Boston does, much less the whole region. So I think it does raise a whole issue, and this comes back to Jocelyn's point about the role of advocacy and the ways in which we could be supporting advocacy organizations at this difficult time. We, as private foundations, Paul's in a different zone, as he noted earlier, are not able to advocate because of various prohibitions, but we can certainly make grants for advocacy purposes. I guess we can't directly make them for advocacy purposes, but we can make general operating support grants to institutions that may then choose to use those dollars to advocate. So that's, I think, one role that we can play. But you also point out another tension that we haven't talked about yet today, and Paul's touched on it, and I want to surface it, and that is, I think for foundations, one of the tensions that we are constantly balancing is this tension of building long-term partnerships with organizations that are enduring, so that those organizations, not that they become reliant on our funding, but those organizations know that we're there for the long term, provided that they're delivering the kinds of results that they say they will deliver with our resources. Balancing that, and lots of people love to be in long-term relationships with foundations. But then conversely, there are a lot of organizations that are not part of that network that are trying to find ways in the door and trying to figure out ways to build that kind of relationship. It's a zero-sum game. The resources are indeed finite. So as a foundation, one of the things we're constantly balancing is we want to be long-term partners. We don't have policies that some foundations have where you say you can apply, and if you get a grant for 3 years, you have to take a year off, which I think is always kind of a very curious policy that some foundations have. I don't know what you do during that year off, because then you can come back allegedly. So I think part of it is we want to build those long-term partnerships, but you have to balance that with also the ability to be open and receptive to new ideas and organizations.
And then just quickly, I wanted to just build on what Paul and Jim have offered, because I think that those are the ways that we're going to have to move forward in this very vague, murky area or landscape for a while. But we do have to begin to, so for a long time now, philanthropy has, I guess for the last decade or so, we've been looking at business practices and how do business look at results-based, investments, and how do we apply that to our grant making. And what we really might want to look at instead is how do the groups that we work with, how do they define success? How do they define the metrics that are going to tell us whether or not they're making progress? And if they're not partners with us in that, then we can fund them, but we're asking them to do things that may not even make sense. So part of what we have to do is really shift our thinking through what do results and outcomes look like, and it really has to come from the perspective of what the organization is trying to get done. The other part, which really is funny to me, because we adopted that aspect of the business sector's application to investments, but we didn't adopt the risk part. So we're less comfortable with risk, and so I think what we'll have to do in the future is redefine what risk means for us. Like what will a foundation lose if the outcomes don't happen? And how long does change take? So Jim's point about, a 3-year grant is one thing, but really some of these changes, I don't want to harken back to the civil rights movement, but I'll go ahead and give that example. That wasn't a 3 years, oh wow, you didn't pass the Civil Rights Act, so, oh well, no more money for you. So I think we're going to really have to reshift how we think about risk.
I love that, the point about risk, because sometimes in philanthropy you hear the expression risk capital, and the idea is that this should be money that is willing to take risks and money that's willing to fail. Businesses don't want to lose money, so oftentimes they don't want to take risks with their money. But philanthropy should have that ability. And I actually think, Jim, when I was talking to Barbara Hostetter, one of the Amos and Barbara Hostetter are the money behind BAR, she had said that part of the reason early on they were so private is they wanted to be able to make mistakes in private. They wanted to maybe spend money and it didn't work out the way they wanted, and they didn't want to be criticized for it. And I think that's a healthy view.
I think that's right, but at the same time, I also think that I fully agree that I think philanthropy is uniquely positioned to devote risk capital, to invest in risky ideas, to invest in leaders that may not be tried and true. Many people have said, would Martin Luther King Jr. have gotten a grant from the Ford Foundation in the 1950s? And the answer is, yeah, probably not, because of the way that the institution functions. And so being able to invest in leaders who are advancing powerful ideas is, I think, one of the most important roles that we can play. But hand in hand with that, I think foundations, and this comes back to your earlier question, Sacha, about where do we fall short. I think we fall short in talking about where we have made mistakes. I think foundations it is not a field that is very good at talking about where we have failed as foundations. And I think that that's an area where you hope that foundations could be better. When I was at the Irvine Foundation, I remember in 2006, about 4 years into my tenure there as CEO, we were very public about a major multi-million-dollar failure. It was an initiative that we designed and that basically flopped. And it was about $30 million of investment in it. And we wrote a case study and we put it out there. And we talked about it, and I spoke at conferences and all of that. A decade later, people still refer to that as one of the examples of foundations sort of talking openly about risk. And I was amused one day, this was years ago, we all do Google searches on ourselves, so I'll just admit that. Doing a Google search, one of the first, on the first page, like the third entry, Jim Canales, the poster child for failure in philanthropy. And it was because somebody had written a piece about, you know, what we had done. It was an unfortunate headline, but so be it. As Sacha knows, we don't write our own headlines.
Any other questions from the crowd? Yes.
You talked a little about social investing. I was wondering about the future of social impact bonds or social innovation finance and partnering with government to do that.
Well, we're involved in a couple of these experiments, and for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a new idea, a relatively new idea of involving the private sector in public efforts that can be measured in a way that savings can occur and be documented, savings in public funding. So, for instance, the problem of recidivism, of course, is very, very costly. People going back into jail for crimes after having been there before. If you could reduce the recidivism rate, correction systems would save enormous amounts of money. Well, one of the pay for success programs we're in is just that. It's an effort to reduce recidivism, quantify what that savings is, and return it to private sector investments in the form of a return. This is a very young field. It started in the UK a few years ago and has migrated to the US. There's a lot of excitement about it. I think maybe a little too much, given the early and unproven stage of this strategy. But it is very tantalizing to believe that we could do this, because it would unlock flows of capital for the nonprofit sector that just aren't there right now, to convert positive results into savings, into returns, into more funding. It's very seductive, and we're certainly very hopeful about it. It's kind of a holy grail, you know, to go after. But I just want to caution again that we're at very early stages. These are complex undertakings that require a lot of patience and relationship building and trust, but hopeful, promising, and deserves to be tried, and it is being tried.
I want to jump in and say that as a reporter, I sometimes have to write about this. It is so complicated and difficult to explain. Even the name social impact bond, I think it suffers from a bad name. It's unclear what that means. The recidivism case Paul mentioned, there was a very test case at Rikers Island, and I think it was Goldman Sachs that put in the money, and if recidivism rates were reduced a certain amount, they would get money from the state. It's incredibly complicated. Although in Boston, we have a big nexus of this here. Tracy Palangin runs an organization called Social Finance. So we are quietly a hub of trying to do this, but I don't know that there's any case that's completely at its completion to prove whether people feel that it works or not. It's, again, very much in,
very early stage.
Yeah.
And that's here in Boston. So before coming to Boston, I was working at the Kellogg Foundation, and actually we applied with the groups. They are very complicated because you have to engage all sectors, all community members. You have to get everybody on board, and then philanthropy and the state and the federal government will actually match some of the dollars to put into a fund that can look for return on investment. The great thing about it, when they work out, and it's in its second year, and I'm planning on checking on it in another month. There's a conference about what happened with that fund, but it looks like it's working well, because what happens is, we always ask this question in philanthropy, so how are you going to be sustainable after we don't give you money anymore? And you know, I actually don't ask that question because I've gotten those looks that, you know, like, what are you talking about? If you're not going to give me money, what am I going to do? You know, so this is a way in which these programs can get off the ground and be sustainable. The recidivism one is particularly exciting because, and I talked to someone who works in the city who is looking at that, you know, the city working with a number of community partners to maybe launch a program like this. And what's exciting about the recidivism work is the return on investment shows up very quickly. So I heard about in a pilot program that the city is working with, the recidivism rate is, I think the program is about a year old. I'm not sure, Joyce, but it's less than 5%. And it's less than 5% with a small n. So a small number, I'm sorry, I used to be a researcher in another life, so a small number of cases. And so one can imagine that in the future that it is actually even less than 5%. It's like 1% or 2% in terms of recidivism. But what is happening is that you are cutting back on the amount of money that you're spending on to keep people locked up in jail, and they're able to be in their communities to actually be productive citizens that contribute to the tax base and that help to raise their kids and that help their neighbors. And so it's a complex process, but it actually is a very simple idea that, like, if you make investments early on, they pay off and you don't spend much money later. And so anyway, I'm a fan.
There was another question back there. Yep.
Hi, I volunteer with Haymarket People's Fund, which is a community foundation that puts resources into the hands of people doing racial justice organizing. And we have an interesting model in which volunteers, people who are community organizers and activists, are the decision makers, not the staff. And I'm curious, as you look at the future of philanthropy, what are systems that you're putting in place to be more accountable to the communities that you're giving money to?
You know, there's an effort that we are newly a part of at the Barr Foundation called the Fund for Shared Insight, which was created by a number of national funders, Ford, Hewlett, and others prominently among them. And what motivated the creation of the Fund for Shared Insight was this notion of how are funders, what are the feedback loops, both for funders, and Paul spoke earlier to the important role that the Center for Effective Philanthropy has played to help get grantee blind surveys for us. That's valuable. But more importantly, what are the feedback loops ultimately for the beneficiaries of the work that we're doing? What are the ways that we're actually learning, whether the ways we're developing strategies and the work that we're actually doing is having an impact for those populations directly? So I've been heartened by this, and we've become much more engaged in this effort because I think there's a lot that we can learn, and it's an effort to try to develop more methodologies, develop new tools, develop new approaches so that we can think about ways to embed this work more deeply in the work of philanthropy. Sacha and I were both at a conference, actually Jocelyn was there too, and Paul spoke, in fact all of us were there at various forums at a conference for the Center for Effective Philanthropy because it was here in Boston.
We just all travel around together.
Exactly, it's a traveling road show. The four of us were all there, and one of the speakers one evening was Brian Stevenson, who many of you may know, who is running the Equal Justice Institute and has done some very important work around racial justice, social justice issues. And if there was a core message that I took away from the talk he gave at dinner, it was this. He talked about the importance of being proximate to the work that we're trying to do. And I think that's what's at the heart of your question. I think at times in Funderland, we can get pretty removed and we're hanging out with consultants and we're developing logic models and we're talking about return on investment. But at the end of the day, we're not as proximate to the people that we're trying to help through the work that we're doing. And I think that's a very important lesson and something that we need to be constantly reminding ourselves of.
One of the things we're doing in that vein, which is causing a lot of excitement at the foundation, is what we call a grassroots effort, where we employ really knowledgeable neighborhood leaders to identify people who are doing amazing things, but completely below the radar screen, not people who would ever apply for a grant to the Boston Foundation. They're not part of a incorporated organization, but they're doing extraordinary things that perhaps could be enhanced or scaled up. And the city is full of people doing extraordinary things without any notice or fanfare. And we're going to try to do a better job of identifying who those folks are and creating opportunities for the growth of their idea or the growth of their impact.
Any more questions from the floor? Nothing? Anyone in from the nonprofit sector? Anyone who wants to weigh in on what they think philanthropy is doing, could do better? Experiences you've had that you think would be good feedback for Paul or Jim or Jocelyn?
After your setup, you think they're going to tell us? There'll be an anonymous box in the back, and you can drop your idea.
I saw one hand in the middle.
Thank you. Well, I hesitated to ask, however, in this kind of environment in which we're in, and you mentioned the fact, the unique role that you have. What kind of activities could bring to a community building? How do we build community, and how could some efforts be put into that place rather than everybody having their own niche, if you will? But look at the community as a whole and saying, and you also refer to values, the values of your foundation. What are our values as a community? And so what is the role of government? Certain things should be done by the government because all the foundation put together are not going to. So where is that dialogue to educate the people and see what the role of the foundation is to do something that's risky, something that's new, and recognize those people and then bring them to the media and say, look, you should recognize these people, let the community know the wonderful work that you're doing. So I don't know if this is aspirational or it's just a vision of mine, having worked both for the for-profit and the non-profit, and having seen that when it works, it can really create, obviously we all know that, it can create incredible things, but I think that today's environment is so much more complex insofar as finding agreement on what those values are and what those priorities are. If we have dollars, where do we put them? Where do we invest them in such a way that we can see the needle moving in a direction that benefits the entire community? I was hesitating to say that, but you having
I would just say, and not because we were invited here by the city of Boston, but the reality is, I think what the city has done, and these charts in the back of the room speak to this, I think that's exactly what the mayor was seeking to do in initiating a process to have our community come together and think about what we aspire to be, what our vision should be, and how we translate those concepts and those ideas and those aspirations into tangible changes in our communities. And I think the work that the Imagine Boston 2030 team has done, which they're now inviting all of us here and more broadly to engage with, to improve upon, and to help probably think about prioritization as well, because it's a collection of wonderful ideas, but at some point the challenge will be how do you translate a set of ideas to implementation. And so I think it's an exciting time to be here in Boston, and to be here at a time when you've got a leader for the first time in 50 years inviting us to be part of that kind of process.
So we all be volunteers and voices for that, so that the ripple effect reaches a larger audience, because there's a narrower group of people that know all of this. How do you bring it to the larger audience?
Yeah, and I would love to see, I think that the effort is incredible. I mean, what we were provided in preparing for this session was a remarkable report that the city put together that's over 200 pages. So the number of people who were engaged in developing what the city has found for the plan for 2030 is just incredible. So really do take some time to look at that. I haven't seen anything like it. What I will say is that I would love to see the kind of community feedback loop be a permanent structure in some way. I don't know how it's facilitated so that it is not, okay, we designed it, okay, we'll just go home, and it's the city's responsibility to take care of it. We feel that it is not just the city, we all have a role. Every sector has a role, including the nonprofit sector and community as individual residents. And so I want us all to own that plan and to feel that there is a regular way that we can engage with the city who's asked us to tell us what you think. But I want it to be less episodic and more of a process that is regular, and community knows where to go to give that feedback. So that's something that I will be thinking about a lot with my team and with my colleagues about how can we support that community voice having a regular presence.
Thank you.
Anyone else in the audience? Thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I want to say thanks to Jocelyn Sargent, Paul Grogan, Jim Canales, and thanks to Joyce for organizing this and making it such a great process behind the scenes. Thanks for coming tonight.
And thank you, Sacha.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.